G20 summit is almost upon us. But in the run-up to this important event, what role has the B20 played in putting Africa's economic goals firmly on the world stage? Let's find out in the blue space. Hello and welcome to this special edition of The Blue Space, brought to you by Standard Bank Corporate and Investment Banking. I'm Joanne Joseph. Well, the world's eyes are on Africa, and South Africa in particular, as global leaders gather in Johannesburg for the G20 summit. As the president and host country this year, South Africa's set the agenda for the continent. But what we don't often acknowledge is the machine grinding away in the background for an entire year before, the B20 or the Business 20 that precedes the G20 summit, ensuring that the most pivotal issues make it onto the international discussion table. So, how does it all come together? Let's find out from the B20 Local Business Advisory Council Chair and CEO of Business Leadership South Africa, Busisiwe Mavuso, and Standard Bank's Executive Head of International Trade, Luthando Vuba. Welcome to you both. Lovely to see you both again. Busi, I'm going to kick off with you. What is the B20 and what does it actually do?
Yes, so the B20, Joanne, is the business arm of the G20, and what we discuss in the B20 are economic policies that are meant to drive global growth and global development. I think the biggest misconception that it has been in South Africa is that this is meant to be a B2B platform, and it is not. I think the fact that the B20 is being hosted in South Africa doesn't change the agenda. The issues that we still discuss there are still global issues. The only advantage that we have is that as South African business leaders, we get to chair the different task forces. There's been 8 task forces, and in chairing the task forces, it therefore means you get an opportunity to influence the agenda. You get the opportunity to put on the table the issues that are pertinent and that are important to you as a country, as a continent, and as the broader global South. And I really think that our business leaders have done a brilliant job of precisely surfacing the issues that are important for South Africa, not just for South Africa, for the broader African continent, as well as the global South. When we took over the presidency at the beginning of the year, we were very clear at your end that we want to make this an Africa B20 because South Africa is the only African country in the G20 membership. So it was important that we actually fly the flag, not just for South Africa, but for the broader continent.
I mean, that sounds absolutely brilliant. Luthando, 8 task forces that Busi has alluded to there. What were the toughest challenges they've had to tackle over the last year?
I think the B20 process, it's 20 countries, it is across different time zones, it's different interests, it's developed economies, it's emerging and developing economies or markets. And you're having all of that having to confluence on what do we say about finance and infrastructure? What do we say about just energy transition? And so I like what Borge said, the chair of the World Economic Forum at the opening ceremony, that at times you're going to disagree. At times there's going to be disengagement or disagreement,
tensions,
but stay the course because it's through that discourse, debate, and really getting the different views that we land at what actually is the policy recommendation, actually enriches what goes then into the G20 and what they debate and discuss further, right, and can advance as then the country governments that are in the process.
I mean, that's great. How successfully have previous host countries managed to get their priorities onto the Global 20 agenda in regard to the B20 in particular?
What's been great to observe in the previous G20s, especially the Global South countries, there's been a very intentional policy recommendation at looking at infrastructure development and policy that advances SME participation in the economy. Because when you look at SME participation, which accounts for over 50% of employment in most economies, and in Africa that's about 80%, it is really where the focus should be on how do we optimally ensure that both a policy and from a business, we are driving an operating environment or markets where SMEs one day survive better, but also there's opportunities for them to grow. So I think that's been very great to observe, and India going to Brazil, yes, and before India it was Indonesia, and then obviously after Brazil it was South Africa. So that's been very good to observe, and I think as South Africa we've continued that and spurred that on to look at how we continue that as a theme
And I understand, Busi, that you've already put 30 policy recommendations forward to the G20.
Yes.
Which of those do you think could bring about the most positive change for African businesses?
You know, if I can probably maybe just highlight two, the one that I'm excited mostly about is the one recommendation that came from Trade and Investment, which talks about the fact that we need to rally as the global economy, we need to rally behind the African Continental Free Trade Area to ensure that we unlock this $3.4 trillion market for Africa. So it's very interesting because the global economy, Joanne, also realizes that Africa is the continent of the future. Yeah. We're sitting with about 1.4 billion people in the continent at the moment. We're going to be sitting at 2.7 billion in 2050. Capital globally is looking for markets. Africa is the market of the future. 25% of the world's population is going to be coming from Africa in 2050. So it makes sense, you know, for them to definitely look at Africa's development and look at how Africa is actually supported, you know, in as far as this development journey is concerned. I think the other one came from the task force that Luthando participated in, of finance and infrastructure. Therein, we are looking at how do we actually bring in the cost of capital down for African countries, you know, for developing countries, for global South countries. How do we actually ensure that these countries are supported by these multilateral agencies? How do we ensure that the multilateral agency funding is actually made more accessible to help Africa, to help the global South, you know, so that the infrastructure deficit and the infrastructure challenges that are actually existing in the continent and in the broader global South are actually paid attention to.
Certainly, and I mean, we're so impatient for it to happen, Luthando. Which policy recommendations do you think the G20 could immediately implement to benefit the global business community?
The one I want to highlight is how do we create more investable projects? In other words, where do projects fail? And a lot of it is around the technical assessment and pre-project work, and how do we get that right? And then how do we mobilize more capital towards that? And it is to say, governments, how do you review, one, the Basel III rules on what you expect, you know, the financial institutions to be holding as capital? You know, that was instituted, you know, for a certain time. It's been quite a period since then. So I think it's not just, oh, let's do this, but they're very practical mechanisms that we have put forward. And these are things that could be implemented immediately. It doesn't require too long processes. It's not too medium term. These are really immediate maneuvers that can be done. And I mentioned SA already has the policy, you know, that, you know, is allowed within the PFMA, the public-private partnership. And how do you then start to create attractive, impactful projects that philanthropic capital wants to move towards? So we can talk about education, which is one of the task forces is focused on. We can talk about just energy transition, which is another task force focus. And, you know, how do you start to mitigate, you know, the climate change piece while ensuring you enable access to energy? Because that's still a big, big challenge on the continent. You're not going to realize a free trade area effectively if you don't have energy and infrastructure, critical infrastructure, especially roads, rail, and your ports. So how do you get those in place? And, you know, those are impactful and speak to what philanthropic capital is keen to move towards. But this is a mechanism of how to do it.
And I think, Busi, what Luthando has said that kind of leads into my next question to you, which is how do the continent's business leaders, policymakers, global investors ensure that momentum is maintained after the G20 summit is over?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the brilliance of what we did as South Africa. We were very deliberate and intentional about ensuring that we bring recommendations, or we put recommendations across which are executionable, you know, which are implementable. So we didn't just focus on the what, we also focused on the how. Because as we looked at what has been done with previous B20s, we saw that there were a lot of recommendations. Some of them might have actually been adopted by the G20, you know, but you look at, so once you have this, once this has been adopted, how do you then implement it? So I think the practicality, you know, of how to actually put what we have recommended and put across in place is definitely important. And I think that is precisely the beauty about what we have done, but precisely because from a B20 perspective, this is being co-hosted by BUSA and PLSA. The work that we've done is therefore going to be institutionalized. You know, the fact that you've got the Local Business Advisory Council, which I chair, which is the South African CEOs, about 15 of them, you know, who have actually been working with the B20 Steering Committee sitting behind closed doors, and I think sitting in the engine room, ensuring that the work that is being done aligns to businesses on the ground, you still have that institutional memory. You know, the fact that you have Luthando and the South African CEOs who have been leading these task forces means that we still remain, you know, with that intelligence and with that institutional memory. So it then becomes easy for us to actually pick up from where we are actually going to live this off, you know, in November. Actually, there's not going to be even living off of anything, Luthando. We're actually just going to continue. Once we hand over to the US on the 1st of December, the work still continues, because we are also saying, as Busa and Pele say, what are the 2-3 recommendations, irrespective of what the G20 does? What is it that we'd actually like to take forward as a country? And precisely because there's clarity in terms of how these could be implemented, it's then going to make it easy, you know, for us to actually take those forward. So that is the work that is underway at the moment. To say, out of the 30 recommendations that have actually come out, what 2 or 3 does South Africa actually want to take forward to ensure that we can actually advance our economy?
I just want to add something.
Yes,
to that.
yes, go ahead,
Very
Luthando.
importantly, in being practical and implementable recommendations, very importantly, we've built also into these recommendations KPIs.
Yeah.
So when the US gets to this period of next year, we're looking at KPIs of what has moved linked to the recommendations that would have come out of the B20 recommendation. I think that's a very important point, because also when we took off from Brazil, we received their KPIs. So there's also a measure that we're going to be doing on, based on their recommendations, what has moved, and where we haven't had progress, what were the bottlenecks. And those also then become key in terms of, you know, what does the next presidency and then therefore country that takes over B20 need to then look at and review.
Luthando, an issue that's close to my heart. It's predicted that by 2050, Africa will have the largest workforce in the world. But we know that we've fallen behind with education, with skills development. How's the B20 suggesting that Africans work together to upskill this workforce for the future?
It's a good one, because one of the task forces looks at digital transformation. And one of the key recommendations has been to say there's a lot that can be said around digital transformation, digital technology, whether you're talking about the infrastructure or, you know, the software or the advancements of innovation. And they've intentionally said what we need is the education of basic digital skills advancement.
Yeah.
So how do we look at the education piece to make sure that we are churning out the digital skills or tech skills that we will need to actually absorb that workforce that you've referenced, you know, and of which the majority, or as Busisiwe mentioned, quarter will be coming from here. When I think about that workforce, it has to be very intentional, not just the education, but which skills. The WEF talks about skills of the future, and that keeps shifting, you know, but I think it needs to be very intentional. What does that mean for Africa? And then when we look at food security, 60% of the arable land is here globally, right? So how do we intentionally look at technology and us getting to smarter farming? Because it's not just going to be about tapping an opportunity to feed the continent, but also feed the world. And I think there's an opportunity to see how we leverage tech to do that optimally. And so I think when we look at that future prediction, these recommendations have to speak about what needs to be put in place now to make sure that that demographic dividend, as it's usually quoted, is actually absorbed into not just any skill or education, but skills that will matter and actually advance the economies of the continent.
Joanne, if I can just add something to that. So I think that is what is exciting for me about this and the focus of it on Africa. Luthando speaks about the demographic dividend. 60% of our young people in the continent are under the age of 25, and that is why we call it the demographic dividend. But let's be honest that if you're sitting with 65% youth unemployment, as we have in our case in South Africa, where you have more people that are unemployed than those that are employed in all the provinces except Gauteng and the Western Cape, then it's not really a demographic dividend, it's a demographic burden. So unless and until we are very intentional about having interventions in place that are actually going to cultivate this asset, you know, to ensure that these young people can meaningfully participate in the economy, then we are actually going to be sitting with a burden. So the work that has been done on this front is absolutely important. That is why as South Africa, when the B20 leaves, you know, and it's being hosted by America next year, we can't sit and say our work is done, not when we have these brilliant interventions that have actually been put in place. We have to find a way of how we actually implement some of these, to ensure that we advance our young people and cultivate them into the asset that they are.
But Busi, could there be a lasting impact for South Africa now that it's hosted the presidency of the G20?
It's precisely going to be how and what we decide, to do with it. Precisely the conversation that we're having, at the moment. What do we want to do with this rich, and brilliant work that has actually been put together? Because these are not just policy positions, these are practical interventions that we can actually put in place to deal with our Achilles heel as South Africa and as the African continent. Achilles heel being the stubbornly high levels of unemployment, the stubbornly high levels of poverty. In South Africa's case, being the most unequal country in the world.
Some final thoughts from you on the outlook for African growth, Luthando?
I think it's exciting. You have, out of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world, 10 of them are here. If you've read the news recently about Namibia, which is being projected to be the fastest growing economy in the coming years. Oil and gas discoveries that have been made there. We also know that it has the lowest density on the continent. So in terms of not only having all of that opportunity of exploration, etc., it's also prime, as a destination that will attract expats into that economy. So I think we look at the story of Tanzania, they've intentionally looked at the infrastructure investments and how they've been the fastest growing economy, I think 2 years in a row. I think the prospects for the continent are great. We just need a very quick, urgent, and very intentional move from our policymakers to start to put policies in place and regulation that enables rather than disable, policy enablers that actually make sure that we attract investment instead of becoming less desirable when it comes to investments. And actually, interestingly, and one of the things that we try to elevate through this process to tell the story better. Globally, Africa is actually the region that has the lowest default when it comes to sovereign borrowing. So we often hear about the risk of Africa, but we don't talk about actually African markets are good repayers when it comes to debt.
Well, it really sounds like we have our work cut out for us as Africans. Thank you both so much for that. That is where we wrap it up for today. Thank you to both of you for joining me for this insightful discussion. Busisiwe Mavuso, the B20 Local Business Advisory Council Chair and CEO at Business Leadership South Africa, and Luthando Vuba, Standard Bank's Executive Head of International Trade. We cannot wait to see how this historic opportunity will reshape Africa's position in the global economy. From me, Joanne Joseph, take care till we meet again in the blue space.
Visit www.standardbank.com/bluespace to find out more about the Blue Space. Africa. It's vast, rich with resources and alive with the drive and innovation of its people. Join me on this series as we explore stories from the diverse markets of this continent we call home and discover how one bank, together with its clients, are driving growth and creating impact. Search CIB Stories of Impact to watch the full story.